Tonight, the country is remembering Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The longest-serving woman on the High Court died tonight at the age of 87. Ginsburg is being remembered as a champion of justice and a trailblazer for women.
She passed away surrounded by her family due to complications from metastatic pancreas cancer. She had survived multiple other bouts of cancer, all while refusing to step down from the bench. Ginsburg was one of the Supreme Court's more liberal voices, fighting for civil rights and gender equality.
Ginsburg's death leaves a vacancy on the Supreme Court.
A heated political battle is expected to take place over who will take her place just weeks from the election. Eyewitness News reporter Henry Ramos is getting the perspectives of two local experts.
Henry, what are they telling you?
Aaron and Deborah, experts say the SCOTUS vacancy will become, if not one of the main issues this coming election. What will President Trump do? Will he name a nominee and try to get one confirmed through the GOP-controlled Senate? Well, tonight there are reports the president in the coming days will name a nominee, and if so, this will certainly create a political showdown. Well, tonight I spoke with a couple of analysts, and both say they hope that the president would nominate a woman to replace Justice Ginsburg. As a conservative Trump nominee, this person would tip the balance in the Supreme Court, where conservatives already outnumber liberals. Now, the process to confirm a nominee, it certainly takes time. Though tonight, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell making this clear in a statement, saying whomever President Trump nominates to replace the late justice, there will be a vote on the Senate floor. The president's opponent, Joe Biden, saying late tonight the nomination to replace Justice Ginsburg should happen after voters pick the president. Well, I spoke with the UTSA lecturer and a St. Mary's law professor about what happens next.
I think that if President Trump wants to make this a positive, then he would consider nominating someone that would be closer to the middle of the political spectrum.
He may just decide to push it, to go for it. He may decide he's got the majority in the Senate and he's got the presidency, but already I'm hearing on the news that there's at least a couple of Republicans that are saying they won't vote for a replacement until after the election, until they know who the new president is.
And just days before her death, Justice Ginsburg, in a statement to her granddaughter, says that she wishes not to be replaced until the next president is sworn in. Meanwhile, right before this newscast, President Trump releasing a statement saying in part that the nation is mourning the loss of a titan of the law. Meanwhile, Texas Senator Ted Cruz is hoping that the president will name a nominee by next week. We're live tonight. Henry Ramos, KENS 5, Eyewitness News.
Henry, thank you. A Supreme Court Justice, Antonin Scalia, died in President Obama's final year in office. He nominated Merrick Garland in March. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said at that time any nomination would be null and void, and the next justice should be chosen by the next president. Now McConnell is promising a vote on a replacement President Trump nominates just weeks before the election.
Here's how that nomination process works. First, nominations are sent to the Senate Judiciary Committee. That's where confirmation hearings happen, and the nominees are grilled by lawmakers about their views. Then the committee votes on whether the nominee should move forward. If that happens, the full Senate votes, and the nominee needs approval from 51 members to be confirmed.
Mourners are gathering at the steps of the Supreme Court tonight to remember Justice Ginsburg. She became a pop culture icon for her refusal to step down during her health battles and her unparalleled work ethic. You can read more ways Ginsburg is being remembered with our continuing coverage on KENS5.com.